to our YouTube exclusive series. We will be continuing this one with Figures of Speech with Dark Origins.
Woohoo!
And we're starting with Sold Down the River.
Definitely have heard this one.
This is a phrase that today means that someone should have cheated, or has been cheated rather, or betrayed by another.
Right.
However, the phrase has roots in the slave trade era of Mississippi.
Imagine that.
If a group of slaves were found to be too difficult to control, they were rounded up and put up for sale in Louisville, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
After the sale, they were then transported to the south to be sold to plantations via a boat that traveled down the Mississippi River.
Right.
Sadly, the slaves were sold down the river were also separated from their families and subjected to much harder labor, toiling in the fields on the large cotton plantations in the area.
Right.
Many slaves chose to end their own lives to avoid being sold down the river, as eyewitnesses claim to have witnessed a slave drown themselves after previous attempts to cut their legs or throat had not worked.
That's so sad.
It is, very much so.
I had no clue that that's where that actually came from, so that's
Nor did I.
Interesting just to know, because I've heard people say that all, for years, oh, he sold me down the river, whatever, or just, or on shows and everything. You've heard it. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I had no clue that it came from something like that, so that's sad, very sad.
So, moving on to the next one, this is an extremely common phrase, smart aleck.
Of course.
A smart aleck is known as today as someone that is rude or someone that acts like they know everything.
Right.
A phrase that was inspired by a man named Alec Hogue. He and his wife Melinda were thieves that roamed the city of New York. They had an elaborate scheme in which Melinda would pretend to be a lady of the evening, who would then lure men into a dark alley.
Oh my
This
goodness.
was a very common practice.
I know.
I imagine it still is.
I imagine.
And honestly, it is genius.
Well, true.
So, hats off to whoever first came up with
There
this,
you go.
honestly.
Yeah.
Lying in the shadows was Alec. She would then proceed to kiss the unsuspecting man, all the while she would expertly be picking his pockets and secretly handing her loot to her hiding husband.
Oh my gosh.
Knowing that the scheme wouldn't last long, as victims would eventually begin to report the thefts, they then came up with a new plan. Hogue devised something referred to as the panel game. In this new plan, Melinda would bring victims to their apartment, where she would then have them disrobe and give a subtle signal to Alec. And he would then quietly emerge and steal everything valuable from their discarded clothing before then sneaking out the back exit. He then headed to the front door and knocked. Melinda would then tell the unsuspecting man that it was her husband, who returned home early. This led to the victim quickly grabbing their clothes and leaving through a nearby window.
Oh my gosh, that's too funny when
Yeah.
you think about it. Oh my goodness.
Again, smart.
It is, actually.
The nickname Smart Alec was given to Hogue by the police as a way of ridiculing him for thinking he could outsmart them, as their new scheme had actually been quickly discovered.
Then they were. I remember that they were arrested and everything. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. But it is smart.
It is.
It's totally clever if you think about it. And, oh my goodness. Actually stealing something from somebody and then having them run away from you. More or less. It's kind of funny.
What would have been smarter is them taking them to a second location and using fake names.
Maybe. But anyway.
That would have, around that time, that would have helped a bit
Right.
in concealing their identity.
Possibly. But it's still a very cool story in a
Oh,
way.
yeah. Anyways, the next one is meet a deadline. This is this well-used phrase dates back to the U.S. Civil War. One of the first recorded uses was reportedly at a Confederate prison. To prevent escape attempts from prisoners, a line was drawn 6 meters or 20 feet from the walls of the prison.
Okay.
An order was then sent out to all the guards that any prisoner seen crossing this line was to be shot dead, which led to the line being called the deadline.
Meet the deadline. That's kind of creepy.
This was actually used in a very well-known movie that I cannot think of the name
Life
of.
with Eddie Murphy, it was. They had the kill line.
Not what I'm thinking about. This is a Western movie.
I don't know that one right off, but I know that one they did because they had those towers set up and said they didn't need fences there because they had the kill line or whatever. So it's the same thing, more or less. But
it's actually a really good movie, and now it's killing me not knowing. It's a slight comedy. Well, not slight comedy. It is a comedy. There's a new sheriff goes into town. The prison is just completely wrecked, and he has to rebuild it.
Support your local sheriff.
Support your local sheriff. That is it. Hilarious movie. Highly recommend. Anyways, went on a tangent there. It has varying meanings over the years. It was once used for printing terminology.
Right, meeting a deadline.
Yeah. Then later it was used to define the age limit for a church minister, which I didn't know.
I had no clue about that one. That was odd. Okay.
However, today it's just referred to the stipulated term or time limit to complete a task.
Right. I got a deadline. Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of crazy when you say that and it comes from something like that. Yeah, I mean, it's weird when you think about stuff like that you don't even have any clue that it had origins like that. But, okay.
So, moving on is the term blockbuster. If you ask someone today what blockbuster was, they would mostly say movie, book, or something similar that was insanely popular.
Right.
However, the term actually originally referred to a gigantic aerial bomb that was reportedly tested during World War II. Mm-hmm. The bomb weighed in at 4,000 pounds, or roughly 1,800 kilograms.
Good grief.
It was said to be able to destroy an entire city block.
I guess so. With that size, my goodness.
After the war, the phrase was used to describe a real estate agent who sold a house to a minority family in an all-white community.
Right. I've heard that before.
Once the family had moved to the area, the block was considered at that time to be busted.
Right.
It wasn't a completely bad thing for the minorities that bought homes in these areas, however. Which,
Right.
It opens new houses because it lowers the pricing. And all that.
Also made a lot of the white families sell their houses for really cheap.
Yeah.
So more of them actually could afford to move these areas. So it actually worked out for them in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
They tried to keep them out of these areas, and then
once they got in,
then they started
property values went down because of how people were viewed back then.
Exactly.
That still are in some places.
So sickening, but it's very true.
Yeah.
But it actually helped some people too. So at least they got some positive out of it. So they kind of turned it back on them a little bit. So right?
Yeah. So next is call a spade a spade. Mm-hmm. This phrase has an innocent origin from ancient Greece. It is meant to mean you are giving your honest opinion about a person or situation.
Right.
However, the phrase took a somewhat dark turn in the late 1920s. Mm-hmm. Claude McKay wrote a novel named Home to Harlem in 1928. In the book, he describes a black character in his novel as a fool spade. Another author, Wallace Thurman, then goes on to describe the black characters as spades. This led to a derogatory term for African Americans.
Right.
It also grew into the phrase black as a spade or black as the ace of spades,
right,
as a way of describing the physical appearance of an individual.
Mm.
Activists have been trying to reclaim the phrase, hoping to ease or erase the ugliness that came from something that was once so innocent.
Yeah, it is sad when you think about it, that it really, that is what it should mean, and that, it does have meanings like that too, because you shouldn't think about the other. It should only be the actual, what it means. You shouldn't even be thinking a spade is a black person.
Yeah.
But we've all heard it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah, we've heard it on, media and everything. I mean, I don't know. It shouldn't even be a thing anymore, but here we are, you know.
So, moving on from that, we're going on to loopholes. Mm-hmm. A loophole in modern times is usually some type of rule or law that can be exploited to avoid consequences.
Right.
Or rather, the wording of a rule or law.
Right.
So, an example of this is finding something in a contract that will release you without penalty.
Right.
So, the phrase actually dates back to medieval Europe. As you might expect, during this time, castles were prone to attacks.
Of course.
This led to precautions in order to provide additional safety for the protectors of the castle walls.
Right.
The owners had the walls of their castles built with vertical arrow slits, which were called loopholes. These holes allowed the guards to fire arrows from relative safety, and these holes were narrow on the outside walls, which made retaliation extremely difficult.
I imagine so, because I've saw them before. They're really narrow, and then they open up inside.
Yeah.
They're weird. It's
They're
weird.
cone-shaped.
Right.
So, inside, the openings were wider, which allowed archers to shoot from varying directions and angles.
Right.
And after the invention of the crossbow, horizontal slits were added to allow for more accuracy.
Well, right, so they could stick the whole thing in.
Yeah. These holes were actually also known as cross slits.
Right, the cross ones, yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But I had no clue that was called a loophole.
No.
I would never think of that as a loophole. That's odd. But cool.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, moving on from that, we're going to pleased as punch.
Oh my goodness.
This phrase has a rather odd origin, originating from a puppet show known as Punch and Judy that began in Britain sometime in the 17th century.
I've heard of it.
This show consisted of a hunchback puppet known as Mr. Punch and his wife Judy.
Uh-huh.
However, this isn't a normal puppet show that you would take your kids to for an outing.
Right.
In this show, Punch kills both his infant child and wife, where he is then arrested and put into jail.
Oh yeah, as you do.
He then produces a golden key which he uses to escape, and after making his break, he then goes on to essentially just massacre a bunch of other people, including Death and the Devil.
Well,
somehow.
you gotta kill them too, right?
Again, I have yet to figure out how you're supposed to kill Death.
I don't know, but apparently Punch figured it out.
And believe it or not, here is where it gets dark. After his killing, or during his killing spree, he would yell out a catchphrase, "That's the way to do it."
Oh my god.
He then would show an insane amount of glee when dispatching his victims,
Oh god.
which led to the phrase, which means you were pleased as Punch when you were
Right.
extremely happy or pleased with something.
Oh god, that's creepy to think about. I
Yeah.
never knew that ever. And I've heard of Punch and Judy. I didn't really know the whole story. I've just heard of it.
I've heard the name before.
I've heard the name more or less. I mean, I didn't really know about all that. But oh my gosh, that's creepy.
Yeah. So, moving on to our last one is Die Hard.
Mm-hmm.
If you know someone that is committed completely and fully to a belief, then you would most likely refer to this person as a diehard.
Right.
This phrase, however, was said to have originated from William Inglis, who was the commander of the British 57th Regiment of Foot. Reportedly, during the Peninsular War in 1811, he ordered his men to die hard during the battle, meaning to fight to their last breaths, making themselves more difficult to kill.
Right.
His regiment was later dubbed the Diehards. Others, however, say that he simply made the phrase popular and that it originated from a 1703 publication that was discussing condemned men that were approaching their deaths. It talked about public hangings and how hard it was for some to die, leading to a lengthy and slow process.
Right. Yeah, we covered that when we were talking about the execution methods
Yeah.
of time. Because some of them they literally would just strangle to death, and it was
Yeah.
awful.
Some
it
of
took a
these
long
were not
time.
like where the drop was high enough to kill you.
Right. It was brutal to watch. I mean, you would
Yeah.
literally watch them flailing for minutes and minutes. I couldn't even know how you
No,
could
I
stomach
don't think
it.
I could stomach that.
That's awful. But yeah.
But that's it for this episode. Let us know what you think in the comments down below, and I'll turn it over to the Belle so she can tell you about hers.
On our next episode, we're going to be talking about strange mental illnesses.
Oh.
Covering some of the more weird ones. So don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to stay disturbed.